long time coming. Have they given you the key to Bath yet? Because they should, or they should do. So Tim is the Director of Education, Research, ACT, Clouds, Action on Addiction, and so much more. His history is in setting up and instigating and, cementing a better industry, a better training. I could give you all of the information, but let's just say that he is he's a pillar in making sure all of our workforce have access to excellent training, outcome studies and research. And in return, that is being supported by Graham Beech and the senior management team at Clouds and Action on Addiction. We're in a time when there's massive flux and massive changes. And, I know, well, I could read it all, but I'm not going to. But let's just say that Graham's background comes from a really diverse and very much needed business and also not-for-profit, consortium-based across the UK. And really, him coming in, he's looking at how to bridge the changes, requirements that are needed in this industry and to better serve the workforce, which in turn, ultimately, and why we're here today, is that ripples to the patients, clients. So, without further ado, Dr. Tim Leighton. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks very much. Thanks for that introduction. And we're going to speak quite briefly. Both Graham and I are going to rattle through our presentation, hopefully coherently. And then we're going to ask you to do some work, hopefully fun work, in the sense that we're going to ask you to discuss some of the questions we're raising in smallish groups. Specify exactly how big the group will be, but around 4 of you at a time, kind of chatting about stuff. The questions will be posed to you as to what to discuss, and we've also left time for that to be brought back into the big group and to actually be discussed. So this is a participatory session. My job really is to give a bit of history. I mean, I've been in the field a long time. I mean, possibly not as long as everybody here, but anybody here, but I started working in the addictions field in 1985, which I think is 33 years ago, and I was a counsellor at a place called Clouds House. I've been lucky enough to get 2 speaker slots at this conference, so tomorrow I'm going to be talking a bit more about the history of Clouds House and the model that came over from America at that time in the 80s, and talk about the historical changes that have been going on. Oops, does this work? Rehab, residential treatment. It's been going on for a while. This is Caldecott Hall in Nuneaton in Warwickshire. Opened in 1926 and is absolutely classically typical of the big old country house into which you pour a number of alcoholics or people suffering from neurasthenia. Something we don't see too much of today, but it's a nice Victorian psychiatric condition caused by too much masturbation. Or drug addiction. I mean, it's interesting to see this old house in the country was treating alcoholism and drug addiction together in 1926. So you've got this model that really has many of the features of what was thought of as utterly up to date in 1980 when the Minnesota model came over and got established by a number of charities at that time in the UK. And here's a picture, and it says it's on the most modern principles. It's got a resident medical superintendent, recreation and graduated occupational therapy are available in the extensive secluded grounds. Well, they would have had a standard iCAAD for sure, telling you about the diverse therapies that were available and the kind of soothing massages and delicious oils and things that your money was going towards when you went there. here it is, a new home for inebriate cases in Nuneaton. When it was changed from being an alcoholism treatment centre, they found some bottles in the attic, and it took 3 semi-trucks to cart them all away. So the evidence for effectiveness is that we discovered that people hadn't actually been perhaps achieving their abstinent goal that frequently. And the attic of the Grand Hall, as I say, contained 3 truckloads of bottles. It's now a conference centre or some such. What on earth is this? God, I've done something bad. I really don't understand these things. What? No. You need to, hang on, sorry. This is, I don't really know where the trackball, here we are, look. Sorry about this. This is a technology that I just simply fail to understand. Slideshow. How shall we do it? There's no button. Sorry about that. It's a nice slick presentation is entirely failing to materialise. There's no button.
Just try the other. You're way on.
Oh, God. Right, okay. Okay, so Caldecott Hall, Clouds House. Extraordinary similarity. This one opens in 1926, this one opens in 1983. So the kind of strap, I've tried to imitate the sort of 1926 typeface underneath my photograph of Clouds House. And if we proceed inside, I'm going to stick to the little arrow buttons. Hopefully that one will work. Yeah, so there's the interior, and you see exactly late Victorian building. When you come into Clouds, you see that. When you came into Caldecott Hall, you saw that. So this tradition of the big old country house is quite an old one. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that this is superannuated, that somehow we don't need residential treatment anymore. Clouds House produced and still produces miraculously transformed people. This is actually not a picture of the Clouds reunion. It's a stock image to protect the clients, the innocent and the guilty and so on. But it represents, to some extent, the scene at Clouds reunion when people come back and visit the centre. And you can see that the people who go to Clouds are extremely lucky to go there. They achieve recovery and they come back in great numbers. So we're not suggesting that this is not, it's worth throwing it away because it doesn't work anymore. Residential is still needed. But you can see that, that it's not, there's a historical context. Caldecott Hall opened in 1926. Max Glatt opened Wallingham Park Hospital, the first NHS unit for alcoholism, in 1952. He opened the ward in Ealing St Bernard's in 1962. Broadway Lodge opens in 1975. Clouds opens in 1983. And I could have listed the dozens of treatment centres that have opened since then. Broadreach House in 1982, and so on and so forth. Promise, Farm Place, there are dozens of them. It wasn't a smooth journey, though. People began to critique and criticise this model quite early on. In particular, Minnesota model was addressed by somebody called David Curzon, I'm going to come to the next slide, who had been the medical director of the Charter Clinic, who said 2 things. One is, first of all, there's no way that the NHS is going to be able to afford this treatment at any scale. So it was going to be restricted to the private sector. The thrust of this presentation is bringing the private and the state sectors together. It's not about one or the other. But essentially, the idea here is that however good this was, and Curzon said, quite honestly, the outcome claims of the Minnesota model take the breath away. And he knew of what he spoke because he was the medical director of the Charter Clinic London. And he was saying, you can't claim these things. Methodologically, to claim that 90% of people recover, what's happening there is you're only looking at the people who complete, you've got a selection bias at the beginning and all of the other problems that are methodologically. managed care in the United States came in the 1990s. This was a gatekeeping mechanism to stop the unlimited expenditure forced on third-party payers for alcoholism treatment. I think tomorrow I'm going to be talking some more about the history of this, and the General Motors bill in 1987 for alcoholism treatment for their workforce was $78 million. So at some point there was an attempt to control and manage all of this. And people don't know about this, but there was a 50% closure of residential centres in the United States as a result of managed care. And in fact, what also happened in the 1990s is that some evidence came out that day programs, outpatient programs, for anything from uncomplicated alcoholism to cocaine dependence were as effective or slightly more effective than residential. So quite a wide range of populations. So what I'm saying here is not, everything's switching over to something else, but here you get the end of a way of doing things, a 20th century way of doing addiction treatment. We all remember the time when there were asylums for psychiatric patients. Most psychiatric patients went into inpatient. Those days are gone. Big institutions close up. There's always a shelf life. Models move on, culture moves on, society's demands about things moves on. And this presentation, by the way, is very much a both and rather than an either or thing. Curzon, this guy from the Charter Clinic said, there can be no denying, talking about the Minnesota model, that this is a good investment if it works because of the subsequent economic savings and the unquantifiable toll in death, physical morbidity and human suffering. However, it seems unlikely that the NHS could ever afford to provide such treatment itself or purchase such treatment from the private sector on a sufficiently large scale to meet the national demand. I mean, that's the point. It's not that private treatment can't be very, very helpful to the people who can afford it and who can access it, but it could never go to scale. That's what Curzon is arguing. And the situation today is much worse than when he was writing, because as we know, this is the age of austerity. The cuts to treatment budgets are even more severe. Residential treatment is still needed. It's not that this model isn't needed anymore. There are some people who are too ill to manage outpatient programs, and there are a variety of other reasons listed there. And it's still wanted. This shrimp here represents the kind of luxury menus and bespoke treatments that are available in the private sector these days. Some people want that. Some people want the extended respite offered by a residential program. Some people will want the opportunity just to get away from everyday life and be somewhere else. Some people like the ambience of residential treatment, which is, to me, somewhere between some combination of a spa retreat and a boarding school. I mean, it'll be somewhere on that continuum, a mixture of things. So it's wanted and needed. Day programs are not new. Minnesota model type day programs were developed in the States in the 80s, including evening and weekend programs for those remaining in work. Outpatient drug-free treatment programs were common in the United States. However, they varied a lot, and what's called a day program could mean anything, really, in terms of contact hours, in terms of the interventions that are used, and so on and so forth. But interestingly, the outcomes were generally comparable with residential settings. It was the idea that people need to go away in order to achieve the outcomes wasn't held out by the activities. The other thing that's hugely changed is that, of course, it's commonplace in the United States, but over here too, there's been an enormous rise in the recovering community. And this is just one example. Cocaine Anonymous, which is a fellowship that began in around 2000, I think, in the United Kingdom. And it's just risen. So from 2006 to 2018, it's gone up from 130 meetings or something to over 500 meetings. And I could have chosen lots of other examples. NA, smart recovery, recovery cafes, whatever you like. The recovering community is growing in visibility and size and diversity, I would say, as well. And that makes a difference because, my own belief after 35 years in the field is it's not what goes on in treatment that matters so much. It's what treatment encourages you to do afterwards and what you in fact do afterwards that makes the difference. And again, that isn't new. I've got some things here. The temperance movement produced social spaces Here's a temperance hotel you can stay in without the danger that when you go down the stairs you're going to hear the chink of glasses and the roar of laughter in the bar. There are going to be other people there who don't drink. There was a billiard hall where I expect you could get lemonade instead of beer and play your billiards. And here's the Brink, which is our Action on Addictions social space, alcohol-free bar in Liverpool. These traditions are not new, they're not original, but they are developing and becoming more visible. Here's a picture of the inside of the Brink. It's a very jolly place. It's in the middle of Liverpool, very well placed, and people have an excellent time in there, and they go in there and they can eat, they can drink, they can see films, they can do open mic music things, they can celebrate recovery in a variety of ways, and people from outside the recovering community also use it. A lot of the customers are there because it's a safe environment where people are not going to bottle you, etc. And here are some recovering walks, marches, whatever. They go on every year in this country. This is brand new. I mean, in the sense that for 20 years I was around the field and there weren't any recovery marches in the United Kingdom. Now they're every year. They're attracting more and more people. This is last year's in Blackpool here. And there are all kinds of recovery stuff going on, as we know. Recovery cafes, mentoring training, recovery coaching, volunteering, recovery role models, recovery champions, family support organisations, websites, online forums, chat rooms, etc., etc., etc. And they're becoming more popular, more visible, more known about. The internet is a remarkable thing, and it's spreading this kind of knowledge around. So this makes a huge difference to the treatment system. There's a huge potential here. It's always been there in a small way. You might think AA is quite a big thing, but in some sense, compared with this, and in terms of its visibility, in terms of its public acknowledgement, this hasn't even really started yet. I think in the next 25 years, you're going to see far more of this going on. SHARP program is an example of something we run. Now, I've got quite a lot of material about the SHARP program. It's all at the end of the presentation. It's not going to be presented to you. You may be relieved to hear. However, if you download the presentation, you will find that there is a lot of quotes from an independent evaluation of SHARP Essex. Now, SHARP Essex was managed for its first 3 years of its life by Obi Inaka, who's sitting in the audience there. We have a couple of evaluations available on the Cloud's Action on Addiction stand. I really recommend that people take a look at that, because you hear the voices of the people who went there, who've been through that in the last 3 to 4 years. Now, again, this is not SHARP is great, residential treatment is old-fashioned and needs to be finished with. It's about presenting the idea that there's a dynamic flux, that there is a change in the treatment environment and the way people do things. And I'm just going to show you one thing. This is a description of the SHARP program. Pointless going through it just now. It's available again on this slide if you download the presentation. But I just want to show you one more. There have been a lot of evaluations of it, independent evaluations, not done by us, but because it was commissioned by the Essex County Council, they have commissioned qualitative and quantitative evaluations throughout the pilot period of 3 years. And this, oh, by the way, the amazing thing about it is that all the referring agencies love it. What's happened in Essex peculiarly, and probably due to human effort rather than accident, is that everybody in Essex loves SHARP. The referring agency love it. Normally in this field you get endless jealousy, rivalry, threat, feeling that if this person opens up that's taking people away from us and all of this. Somehow we've managed in Essex to create a referring agency say, I'm a big fan of SHARP. I think it's been a brilliant service. I don't think it could be done any better. If that was another one, that would be great. Well, there is another one now in the county. We can prepare people and they might, we can't praise it enough here. We refer a lot over to SHARP. It works. And so on and so forth. I think somewhere in the next slide they say they get 90% of their clients into recovery or something. Oh, that's tomorrow. But this is the most extraordinary thing. This was a pilot for 3 years of a day programme in SHARP, and it was tracked by the Essex County Council Organisational Intelligence. It's a sort of oxymoronic organisation. Anyway, they did an evaluation of SHARP, and they've tracked people through their very clever tracking system. Of the 95 graduates tracked, 79% did not represent to substance misuse treatment by September 2016. So that's everybody who went through over the whole 3-year period, just disappeared from the treatment system. 18% had represented, and 2% hadn't been yet discharged. From cohort 7 to 12, no more than 1 graduate had represented to treatment. Now this is amazing. What on earth had happened to them? Well, they had started to sediment and create a recovering community in Essex. And I'm running out of time because we started a little bit late. I'm supposed to be sticking to 20 minutes, and I'm going to stick to that pretty much. We are not arguing here today that intensive day rehab is better than residential and should replace it. We need both. Each has its pros and cons, but assertive linkage to the community of recovery is the key. And this is what we want you to talk about in a minute. The structured day program is a recognised modality. Some look quite good, but a day program modality which is genuinely equivalent to a residential rehab in its treatment goals, degree of structure, group cohesiveness, is not yet properly acknowledged in this country. It's not in the book. People don't realise, if they're looking for rehab, that they can choose this model, and it's likely to be as good, unless they're so ill that they can't face it or they want rehab for one reason or another. This model is probably going to do the trick for them as effectively as if they went to a residential. So there's a question of choice, but people don't know about it yet. And this is why we've emphasised the success of the SHARP programme in this presentation. You will see in the quotes from the people whose voices are in this presentation at the end, is they all praise SHARP over residential. They say things like, well, I went to residential, it didn't work to me, but SHARP did. But of course, that's always the way. People will always big up the thing that worked for them. So you end up with a slightly biased thing about saying, well, this is so much better, it makes much more sense. Why don't we scrap residential? It was no use to me. Day program is the way to go. But that's because they went to SHARP and they achieved recovery there. Same thing if you go to residential, you'll be saying, well, nothing else will work. You've got to go to residential because that's what I needed. Yeah, just to say that the reason why this is called Clouds in the community, Clouds merged with a number of other charities and became Action on Addiction. I slightly regretted, not the merger, but the fact that it became known as Action on Addiction as opposed to Clouds, because Clouds have 35 years of goodwill invested in its brand. Tristan, is he here? No, somewhere there he is. The prime mover behind the first SHARP programme started his counselling career at Clouds House. So there's a link between Clouds, whose name is attached to a residential centre, and the spirit of Clouds, the magic of Clouds, which infuses Clouds and SHARP and everything we do. Intensive structured treatment in the community and residential treatment are not mutually exclusive. They are and should be intimately linked. The continuum of care is a concept in need of revival. And just to finish my bit, I'm going to... do I need to say anything else? Yeah, I mean, it is obvious that the 20th century model of residential treatment, while still relevant, cannot reach the numbers in need of such support. Neither privately funded treatment nor statutorily funded treatment alone will be able to achieve anything like this reach for different reasons. A truly recovery-based treatment system needs everyone working together. And the question for you, after Graham has spoken, will be, how do we do that? How do we make start? What are we doing already, etc.? How can we make this happen when the field is competing for business? It's really a hell of a problem. Okay, so this is a graphic of the Essex system as it could be, and most of this is actually happening. So if you, against the background of the recovering community, which is being created by all of this, you've got SHARP at Braintree. This was the first one. So, the substance use disorder of sufferers could go for a private self-referral, they can go to statutory services, they could go through private therapists. If private therapists knew about SHARP as an option for their clients, they could be referring there. People who need more than the day programme can offer get referred to Clouds House or some other residential programme. The family services are there, being locally available to people in the day programmes. We've got another programme called MPAT that brings families and children together. Foundation 66 is running a mentoring training in Essex, so people can come out of SHARP and they can become recovery mentors, etc. All of these bolster the local mutual aid system. Open Road is a referral agency that meets people at street level, refers to SHARP, refers to mutual aid, etc. Aftercare both from Clouds and from SHARP could join together in order to mutually... So you've got this system that most of which is up and running, but the connections are perhaps not as firm or as known about, particularly the relationship between the day programme and the residential. This is the system in Liverpool. This is my final slide before I hand over to Graham. It's slightly different because in a way we've got this thing called the Brink right in the community, but it's the same thing. We've got pre-abstinence services based in the Brink. We've got a thing called the Brink of Change going on in the Brink, which is a programme that introduces people to the idea of abstinence-based treatment, and people go through a programme of that before they go to either Sharp or Clouds or wherever else they're going. Again, we use volunteers. There's mentoring training available through the Brink, through colleges, through different things. So these systems are beginning to develop, but actually keeping them together, and in particular, in my view, the dilemma of joining the private sector, including private individual therapists, private treatment centres, and this other system that in the past has been kind of held up by the state. I mean, tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the history of funding, of how things used to be funded in the 1980s and how they're funded today. And clearly, there's been a pendulum swing to say, well, it's either one or the other. And somehow we need to make sure that how can they dovetail together? How can we make this actually work in concert? How can we have a business which is inherently competitive actually turn into something that's genuinely collaborative? There's plenty of customers. You know, in a way, it's not like somehow we're short of custom and that we have to compete for customers. Unfortunately, the treatments that we offer are sometimes quite expensive, and that is an issue for people because that's going to limit the number of people who can access. But on the whole, what are the bridges that can be built? I'm going to hand over now to Graham, and my tip is just use that little arrow there pointing downwards. It's the one. If you touch anything else,
possibly go wrong.
No, exactly. If you touch anything else, now Graham's the chief exec of Action on Addiction, and he's going to do a bridging bit between me and you, and then we're going to ask you to do some work.
As I say, what can possibly go wrong? One of the wonders of having a 2-year-old child is that you get someone to help you prepare your slides. One of the challenges is that it's quite difficult to weave that into a highly technical presentation like this on addiction and recovery. Now, I've just raised your expectations to a high level, a highly technical presentation on addiction and recovery, and all the people from Action on Addiction are getting very, very worried and are thinking to themselves, well, we've never heard him be highly technical in the past. Right, so who can guess what that is? A squiggle. Well, it is a squiggle. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah. Any other guesses?
Yes, it could be, yeah.
Well, it's actually Granny. What else would it be but Granny? All of my daughter's pictures are Granny, and she'll be really pleased to hear, as this is streamed on the internet, that
she's an elephant.
The picture looks like an elephant. But Cloud's House, 35 years old this year, a fantastic achievement, and it's still doing fantastic work which does change people's lives and in many cases save lives. And when I look back to the early mid-1980s, when Clouds was getting off the ground and where we are now was all being set up, well, I was actually running a day programme, an intensive day programme for people who were coming to us 4 days a week for 12 weeks. It was a rolling programme, and this was not in the addiction field, although many of the people who I was working with had addiction issues, and we were working very closely with 12-step organisations and with the fellowship, but they weren't there because of addiction. They were there as an order of the court because they were sent to us as an alternative to custody. And people may be familiar with the old 4B centres and all of that, long history now in the probation service. But we had worked out, and these programs were very rare, we were using an interpersonal group work model. And we'd worked out that we could get further quicker with people by working in the here and now. And what we were basically doing was working with the 3 R's. That's reading, writing, and relationships. Well, reading and writing was really important because the people that I was working with didn't have any preschool education, a massive protective factor for youth crime and adult crime. They also didn't have much in the way of secondary education, and they didn't have much in the way of prospects for work. And so real professional teachers were working with them on basic literacy and numeracy, but we were also working on relationships. And these were people who had dysfunctional relationships. They had poor problem-solving skills, and their way of solving problems was to toss a coin, and it may solve that particular problem, but it would create 20 other problems, which usually ended up in them spending a night and probably considerably longer in a police cell. And so they were coming to us, they were looking at how they were relating to other people and looking at their relationships with themselves. And my understanding, although I'm not deeply involved in the delivery of the programme at Clouds, my understanding is that much of what we're doing there is looking at relationships. We're looking at relationships with other people, we're looking at relationships with individuals, and we're looking at relationships with substances and behaviour. I left the probation service in the early 2000s. It was moving in the direction of offender management. And what offender management was about in those days was about containing the issue and managing the issue. It was becoming, in my view, less and less about behavioural change. And so I was becoming frustrated by that. The probation service was probably becoming frustrated by me. And I decided to leave and to join the third sector. By the way, the probation service it's moving even further away in the direction of supply chain management. So we're moving from behavioural change to offender management and now into supply chain management, and there are quite considerable issues around that. But I joined a charity. I joined a charity called Crime Concern, and Crime Concern had been set up by government as an independent voice in the field of crime reduction and community safety. And Crime Concern was behind a lot of the developments that you've seen now in youth justice. It was behind a lot of the developments in the Crime and Disorder Act of 1991. And it was behind a lot of the preventative and youth inclusion work that we saw in the 1990s and into the 2000s. And much of that has now been stripped away. And I'm hearing on the radio as I drive to the station this morning about the uprise of gun and knife crime, particularly in London boroughs. And that stems back to the closure of that kind of work and the termination of that kind of work. What I was learning about with Crime Concern was about community involvement, community engagement, about doing things with people as opposed to doing things to communities. And it was absolutely critical, and I think that is something that flows through today in the presentation about Clouds in the community. And the work that some of the work that I did at Crime Concern, I had the huge privilege of working with Frances Lawrence. Now, Frances Lawrence was the widow of Philip, the headmaster that was murdered outside the gates of his school in Camden when he went out to what he thought was to settle a dispute between some pupils and some lads who were visiting the school. And he was stabbed outside his own school, and Frances set up the Philip Lawrence Awards, and what the Philip Lawrence Awards was about was shining a light on people within communities that were doing things to make their communities safer and to feel safer. And that ran for a huge number of years, and some of the people who did that, very community-led, very small scale in some cases, didn't have huge budgets, but started to make huge inroads in their communities into gun and knife crime. And what Philip said, and it flowed through all of the work we did with Frances, was that every child is capable of greatness. And it's something that's gone through the whole of my career, that I was working with people who'd done some ridiculous and some difficult and some damaging things, but that notion that every child is capable of greatness, and what we are about as practitioners and managers and chief executives and researchers is about creating the space where that greatness can actually come through. Community engagement, all important. We did some work with a community centre. It was a state-of-the-art community centre, and it had been plonked in this community as part of a new build housing association development to reduce crime and improve the quality of life in the community. And what the community said was, well, nobody's consulted us about this. We don't really need it, want it. And 4 9-year-olds went in there one weekend and completely smashed the place to pieces. There wasn't a pane of glass left. And we went in there and started working with the parents of those 9-year-olds to start to look at what that community wanted and needed, and came up with ideas like developing an urban village hall, which people would find useful and beneficial and a catalyst for change in that community. And so we were working, yes, with lots of local authorities, we were working with central government, but we were also working with the private sector, who were trying to get deeper and deeper into disadvantaged communities, but didn't really understand how to make that leap into areas that they'd not worked before. And so you got public, private and voluntary sector communities all working together to one common aim. And so the approach that we were using was an audit to action approach. This was not about going in there and teaching communities what was good for them. It was about identifying local problems, drawing together a key group of local partners and planning together, delivering and performance managing the process and ensuring that the process is sustained where possible at a local level. So what we were doing was developing neighbourhood safety schemes where the police, the local schools, the local community leaders and all of the voluntary and private sector organisations coming together with a sustainable plan on a neighbourhood level, all predicated on identifying local problems and bringing together local partners. Well, what's all that got to do with where I am now and what we're here to talk about, which is about helping people to move from active addiction into active, long-term, stable recovery, whatever that means to them. And it seems to me that change is an internal process. We talk about the magic of clouds. People come back every year for a reunion. We've got one coming up on the 16th of June now, and they talk about the huge life-changing experience that they went through at Clouds. And I'm sure wherever else people found recovery, as Tim said, worked for them, and they remember that. But actually it was them that did it. They wore the T-shirt and they made the change. And I was talking to the mother of a guy who'd been at Clouds only on Friday, and she said to me, yes, we have got the T-shirt. In fact, we've got lots of T-shirts. And started talking about the kind of things that she had been through with a son who was in active recovery, in active addiction, and now with a son who is in active recovery. And so I've not met anybody yet who is in recovery who doesn't talk about the people who helped them along the way. They talk about them doing it, but they also talk about the people who helped them along the way. And it rarely does happen without external support. And at Clouds, and I'm sure everywhere else, we've got the CQC in the UK that is there to ensure that the service that we deliver is well led, that it is safe and that it is caring, and that it is responsive to the people that we work with, but also, to Tim's point earlier, that it is effective. And we owe that to the individuals and the families that we work with. But achieving recovery and staying in recovery goes way beyond treatment services. And we talked in Essex. I remember having a conversation with Obi when I first arrived in the organisation about recovery being contagious, about the ripple effect of recovery, and I never let a presentation spoil a good cliche. There we are. It's the ripple effect that that somebody being in recovery can have on those around them, whether it be a family member or a colleague, or indeed a community. And people in recovery, just like the people I was working with back in the 80s, if they can start to move their lives on, they actually do want to be a force for good in that community. And so it seems to me that treatment providers like Action on Addiction need to be doing much more than providing treatment. They need to be reaching beyond the treatment programme, both in localities, which is where the idea of clouds in the community comes from, but also nowadays online, so that we can develop a force, a positive force for recovery. And Nathan, who's come into the presentation today, we were talking earlier about building momentum around recovery in local communities, and that's certainly what we try to do in places like Essex. And we used to talk in the days of youth inclusion about building a ring of confidence around the young person. And so what that was that it was the family, it was the school, it was the employer, it was the addiction services, it might have been a group related to gang behaviour. They were all working together with organisations like the police and the youth justice services to wrap a ring of confidence around the young person. But partnership work, it's hard work, and it takes a long time, and it often fails. And I could give at least 20 minutes on why partnerships fail, but a lot of it is down to not having a clear understanding of where it is you want to get to at the end of the rainbow. What does a recovery community look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? What does it involve? And these are the things that I'm interested in just exploring with communities and with experts, so that we can start to build that momentum. And start to build the momentum. The momentum's already there, but give it a little push so that it can help. So we're going to hand over to you to start thinking about that. What does a community of recovery look like? And we're going to structure that in a moment. People are leaving the room, but it's not going to be scary at all. That's what my daughter thinks it looks like. It looks like Granny. So what we're going to do, those are the kind of questions which I'll put back up in a moment, but we've got a little exercise. This is something that I used to do a lot in training sessions, particularly with local authorities and commissioners and things like that. And it's called loose change. And I've not done this for a little while, so I don't know whether people carry loose change any longer. But can you just delve into your pockets and your handbags and or your briefcases and just pull out any loose change that you may have? And if you could get into groups of, I don't know, 4 or 5, just natural groups, sitting where you are, and pool your money. If you want it back, remember what it looks like. Otherwise, whoever acts as banker is going to be very rich in the next 20 minutes or so. And if you could just tot up how much you've got between this is not an individual exercise, so if you group together, how much loose change have you got in total? And we do not take cards.
Yeah.
Has everybody got some? Right, if I can ask this group, how much have you got? All in total? £2 and 5 pence. Brilliant. How much you've got? £2.22. Right, okay. How much have you got? No, I'm not going to collect it. Just tell me how much you've got. Whoa, £13.56. That's the group I'm going to spend lunchtime with. This group? £8. They've got so much they can't count it all. Right, once you've worked out how much you've got in total, multiply that by 100,000. So you've got 1.3 million over there, and you've got 200,000 over here, and so it goes on. Right, okay. With your money at your disposal, how would you build a community of recovery? How would you involve local people who are in recovery or want to be in recovery, or maybe don't want to be in recovery in that process? What are the key elements? How do those key elements work together? And how can we build and sustain resilience? So what that is about is, who do you need to get on board to help you sustain resilience? Because back in those days when I was working with young people, there was initiative after initiative after initiative, and it would be there for 3 years, and you build lots of hope, and then you move on and you take it away. And so that's almost worse than doing it in the first place. So you've got 200k, or you've got 1.3 million. Be interesting to see how much more you can do with your 1.3 million than your 200k. You've got 800k. Start to think about some of those questions, and we're just going to open it up later on. You haven't, if you can solve it, fantastic, but you don't have to solve the problem. I'm interested in what kind of themes are coming up in the discussion, and Tim and I will take questions or comments in the next 20 minutes or so. So if we can just take it group by group, please, and we'll go in whatever order you want to. Yes, if you've come up with a fantastic solution, then let's hear about it. But we're as interested in what that exercise brought up for you in terms of opportunities, challenges, obstacles, or whatever. So we'll start over here, if I may. And a mic will find its way. So what would you like to tell us about that exercise? You're being nominated, right? Okay.
Hi, thank you. I've already created something online, something similar to this. What does a recovery community look like? Back in 2015, I had my breakdown, and I had £100 left in my pocket. And I walked the entire length of this country to find out what was going on with mental health and homelessness. So I walked into every town and city that I could to find out what was going on and what was needed. And I created an online community called iCAAD. There's currently 11,000 people within this community.
What's the name again?
iCAAD, mental health and mental fitness. So I created this community, and really it was initially about my own recovery. It was about how I could find and help other people that were in a similar position. So I created this large organisation online that was primarily just online. I thought, how can I bring this into the community? How can I make this work? Last month, I opened up 49 branches, one all over for every county in the United Kingdom. Bearing in mind, I had zero budget. 49 branches across the United Kingdom, all saying and doing the same thing, helping people in recovery. So what we've done is taken this online, and we've now taken it offline. The very first meetup was Warwickshire. It was two weeks ago. We had 60 people attend, not that were just in recovery, but also wanted to know more about mental health and homelessness. So we come together and we've made this. Now the next step, what we're looking at doing, is taking this into the private and into the third sector as well. How to introduce that, that's the next stage where we're at. Getting people on board to say we would like to help fund this and promote it. So that's where we're currently at.
So your £205,000
We've still got.
you've still got.
Did anyone else in the group want to spend it in some way?
Didn't quite get round to that part. But that's what can be created with a little bit of time. I took 3 months out to do this, to walk from one end of the country to the other.
And what's fascinating to me in all of this, or part of what's fascinating to me in all of this, is how much you can do with a relatively small amount of money, but also how do you get funds like that? Do you do it by shaking tins and pooling people's resources? That might be one way of doing it, through crowdfunding and all of that. Or how can you get social investors, corporates, trusts? How can you leverage the fundraising capability of the voluntary sector to be able to catalyse some of the stuff that you're talking about? It's a great story.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Deserves a round of applause, I think.
Good. Did anyone else from this group want to add? Yeah, so can you pass the microphone to your left?
So we took some of the key elements we took from Steve's amazing story was the fact that it's value-based. And in an industry where charities, I worked in a voluntary sector in the drug and alcohol services, we used to compete for budgets every year.
Yeah.
So in a culture where you really don't know whether you've got a job the next year or not, it's really difficult. So what was important in whatever we designed was some form of creating independence. So whatever we're doing, we're not about you need us in which to make this work. We need to create coaching methodology within that to make people autonomous, to keep functioning. And because of the lack of resources, we need value-based philosophies within whatever we do. And the integration of the police force, education, because you're dealing with the whole person.
Yeah.
You can't just focus on the person with the addiction, because if they haven't got a job or they're going back into toxic environments, then it's going to repeat. So how do you expand that? So for that you need police, you need education, you
So
need
you've really
statutory
honed in on
healthcare, and yeah, and exactly. And in terms of the links and how do we build and sustain, yeah, that I'll leave to the other groups.
Perfect.
Because
Can we move to that group then? I think the mic will find its way over there. Michael, you said earlier that you had got some interesting suggestions,
we had
solutions.
£2.22.
Yeah.
So we have 220,000 Hungarian, Belgian, English ideas. But Rupert here has got an idea of how we're going to spend that money. And I'll hand it over to Rupert.
Hello.
Hi.
I can't really take credit for this. I borrowed the idea from a talk I heard yesterday. It was quite interesting.
All the best ideas come like that.
Yes. So basically, taking advantage of something that's already here in the UK is that there are statutory elements of training that all professionals have to undertake, like safeguarding, health and safety, fire, all that kind of stuff. So we could take advantage of that in that something that, in my own experience of working with social work students, they are only given a day's training in addiction, which is crazy considering that basically a lot of them, that's their job, is working with people that are families and people affected with mental health and addiction. So the idea was to add on an extra training, which wouldn't take a lot, that I could ask someone like Tim to create a half-hour online training that someone could do to inform the public of, well, community, like, for example, the police, hospitals, where they could be informed that basically helping them to understand what addiction is, not seeing the person as the problem, and that could be done pretty cheaply, actually. It wouldn't probably cost that much, because once it's online, it's done. And anyone working in a job, if they had to do, and I also nick this from my own workplace, that they're a charity and they've made it their policy that they have an addiction training part, so that's our idea, and
Great, thank you.
appreciate, thank you.
Great stuff. Good. If the mic could go to Dominic's group, that would be great, and then we'll come forward, and then we'll finish.
Okay, so we'd 1.3 million, and so we got straight down to the type of building we were going to have. So no, we envisaged something along the lines of the Brink, and we talked about the suitability of the cafe concept and a place to meet, to eat and drink and do things not necessarily recovery focused, not necessarily only for the purpose of a recovery community. And then we talked about being in the center of the town, not too far, not tucked away, and being there as a physical center for to support the recovery community that would grow around it, or that would sustain a community that was already there. And we talked about the need for that environment to be, you can't just come and, set up a center that's going to do anything when you don't have the right elements in place, such as strong fellowship, self-help community already, a good treatment community around as well to sustain and ally with the community, and as well the local government support. So there needs to be, we talked about some of the places with good recovery communities like Weston-super-Mare and Glasgow, who do have that alliance, or have had a history of that alliance in place. And I brought up this subject of does there need to be some sort of hierarchy or structure within the community, and that's not the philosophy of recovery communities. Doesn't really, wouldn't really agree that that's right. But I think that's why the alliance with the treatment, the local government, is important, because you do need some sort of decision-making ability, some sort of alliance that does help and make some of the strategic and administrative decisions for the community.
Great, thanks, Dominic. I think it is absolutely critical in this whole debate. What is the role of government? And how can government create an infrastructure or an agenda which supports recovery, and how can recovery exist in a way that supports what's trying to go on a local government level? Absolutely can't. But they don't have the money any longer to be able to shape it and control it and develop it on their own.
But some local governments are definitely doing more than others, and you could almost pick your area based on what the local government's already doing, because that's where a recovery community would be more likely to take off.
Yeah. Okay, we'll go there. It's like a hot potato.
Yeah, there we go.
Leighton.
We had, I think, £2.25 and a fruit polo. I've no idea what we had. There speaks the ex-bank. I think there's 2 points to be made here. One is, how do we make this particular cause more investable, right? So cancer's a great thing to want to give money to, children, etc., the violin charities that are perceived to be good ones to give to. We do a terrible job, really, of selling our cause. And as a corporate responsibility, why am I going to give to addiction? It's not a good thing to put up. Don't want to be associated with it. These are just facts that we have to come to grips with. So there needs to be some money invested in the PR of this thing, of actually saying, no, look, this is the reality of this situation. This is the reality of this condition. This is a mental health issue. It's not a moral choice. As long as we're seeing it all the time as this moral choice, we're in a really difficult position in regards to getting any additional funding. In regards to the community engagement piece, I'm doing quite a lot of work at the moment with local government, with the Commissioner in Essex around this very thing. And it's about bringing the two sides together, about bringing the dreams of the community, who want things, you know, I want a medieval archery club on a Saturday. But they don't understand if they have that, they can't have their needle exchange on a Wednesday. This is the reality, and because these two sides aren't talking to each other, they're not part of that process. From start to finish, you can see this thing. They just talk about it in a room, it disappears to the ivory tower, it gets discussed and dispatched. There's no follow-through, there's no long-term, ongoing, daily communication between these two sides. And until those two sides of daily communication happen, where one side knows what the other's doing and for why, then until that time, in large part, it will be a nonsense. So there's a huge sales job that needs to be done, and I'd invest a lot in communication, communication, communication.
Well, I mean, who's going to... Yeah, I agree with that. Some very good points.
And finally?
Hi. Well, we split our idea into two. We gathered £8, so we have 800,000 to spend. I think we'll spend about 400,000 on our physical idea and about 400 on our digital idea. Okay. So, first of all, we think what needs to happen is we need to identify a community centre, give people the choice, some place to go where they can be managed for whatever reasons, social, psychological, physical, legal, housing and family issues. But we also wanted to supply people with a digital hub, because we know the digital revolution is well on its way, and we need to provide some kind of service that links people together, supporters of people who are in recovery, family members, friends, whatever. And in that digital hub, they would have access to educational material, they would have access to therapists, they would have access to a lot of different things that they would need, and especially for people who have issues with stigma, that would be a great idea. But on the other hand, people who actually want to come to a physical centre for support, that's extremely important as well. So giving people choice, we felt, was a really important. The other really important thing that we talked about was, because this is our first time talking about this, we need to develop systems that are very adaptable. So what I mean by that is we learn, we develop, we learn from that, we test it, and then we go back to the drawing board to improve it. Same for the physical hub as and the same for the digital hub. So that was our day.
Thanks. That's great. Listen, thank you so much for participating. I mean, as Graham was saying to me this morning, we were not expecting solutions, but you know, each group has presented stuff, enormous amount of food for thought for me, and I actually wanted to spend time thinking about some of the things that have been said, and actually I feel like blogging about some of the stuff you've said as well, you know, to actually get some of these ideas out there. Because we do tend to get split, we do tend to, you know, the private sector perhaps and the state sector in particular. There was a slide which I didn't deal with, which is about how particular modalities are associated with particular client groups. So, you know, if you put out the word rehab into the general public, they immediately think of talk show, you know, reality TV hosts who go off somewhere quite luxurious, and that's the image of rehab, that it's a private thing. It is sort of for the rich and famous, as it were. Whereas a day program is probably going to be full of state-funded people. And one of my concerns is, how do we bridge that gap, and how do we bring... Because an AA meeting is an extraordinary thing. And in fact, when I went to work at Clouds House in '85, I went into my first group, and there was a High Court judge, still active, in treatment, residential treatment, for his alcoholism, and there was a woman in the group who had all her possessions in a supermarket trolley. You know, it was a place where those... literally every sector of society was meeting on an equal footing. And in some ways, you know, that happens in prison when you meet Lord Brockett or whatever, and he promises that, you know, after you both get out, I'm sure you'll be very welcome at his home. Well, you discover after you leave that you're not. But strangely, you know, in AA and NA, there might be some chance of maintaining those kind of cross-social relationships.
Can I just say, I don't think there is a problem with that bridge, because that's how it's been. I mean, when Sharp London was going, there was a mixed range of client group in there, and it worked incredibly well. The same with Hope House. I'm sure at Clouds House. I don't really understand why there is an issue with integrating
It isn't.
those two clients.
It's bringing it to scale that's the issue. I mean, for me, I quite agree with what you're saying. It happens, there's beacons of good practice, there are places where this is going on, somehow bringing it all together, and the PR idea of really changing, because a lot of the ways in which addiction is presented, you know, let's say as a brain disease, well, actually there are problems with that from a PR perspective. Reframing it as a mental health issue, however, which is a phrase that was used by this group over here, strikes me as a much more you know, there's a softness and a kind of compassion to that phrase, which, you know, if you put out the idea that everybody's got, or this sector of society's got a brain disease, well, one can imagine them planning the concentration camps now. You know, there's something about that model which tells, you know, that you're flawed, you're damaged, you're different from others. Actually, addiction, as we all know, is a mental health issue that could affect anybody for any variety of reasons. And the brain's important. You know, I use mine almost every day. But it's not where addiction is located in its entirety. There are lots of things beyond it. So actually providing a public relations or a message that actually is acceptable and makes addiction really into something that people are going to have compassion towards instead of condemnation and judgment is actually a hell of a problem.
So before we end, one of the things I find interesting is we've got about £3 million in the room.
Yeah.
And we've got some real synergy between the different across the different ideas. And so I'm wondering, what is it that we could do with £3 million to join the dots up between some of the things that have come up in your different groups and probably save some money, because we can use Dominic's centre, which he's going to build us for 1.3 million, and save some of your 400k, and maybe plough it into something else, which is about communication and chipping away at that stigma, which is as big an issue for us as addiction itself.
Yeah.
Unless there is somebody who's dying to say something that they will be very disappointed if they don't say before we leave. It's nearly 1 o'clock, which I think is our time done, Tim.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for participating.
Yeah, participating.
Thank you.